Brandon Swanson. The last words were, "Oh shit." Picture this. It's past midnight. You're a 19-year-old kid driving home on a dark, rural road in southwestern Minnesota. The cornfields stretch out on both sides of you, disappearing into blackness. There are no streetlights, no other cars, just gravel crunching under your tires and the faint glow of your dashboard. And then, your car drops. One moment you're driving, the next your front wheels are in a ditch and your car isn't going anywhere. You get out, look around, and realize you have absolutely no idea exactly where you are. The road all looks the same out here. Field after field after field. Mile after mile of Minnesota flatland under a dark sky. So you do the most normal thing in the world. You call your dad. That call connected at around 1:15 in the morning on May 14th, 2008. Brandon Swanson's father, Brian, picked up on the first ring. His son was stuck, a little turned around, but okay. Brian and his wife, Annette, got in the car immediately and started driving toward where Brandon said he was. That phone call lasted 47 minutes. And somewhere inside those 47 minutes, Brandon Swanson said 2 words to his father. Words that have echoed through this case for 17 years. And then the line went dead. His body has never been found. Not a single piece of clothing, not his phone, not his wallet, not one bone. On one of the most heavily searched stretches of rural Minnesota in history, over 120 square miles covered by hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, horses, boats, drones, and professional search teams, the earth gave back nothing. 17 years later, Brian and Annette Swanson still leave their porch light on every night. This is the story of Brandon Swanson, and I promise you, by the time I finish telling it, you will not be able to let it go. Before we get to that night, you need to understand who Brandon Swanson was. Because this case is not just about a disappearance. It's about a specific kind of young man in a specific moment of his life, and why none of what happened makes any sense given who he was. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota, a small city of about 13,000 people in the southwestern corner of the state, deep in the heart of farm country. Marshall sits in Lynd County, surrounded by flat fields that grow soybeans and corn as far as the eye can see. It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where Friday night football games matter, and where the biggest excitement of the year is usually the county fair. Brandon grew up in this world and loved it. By all accounts, from every friend, teacher, and family member who knew him, Brandon was exactly the kind of kid you wanted your son to be. He was smart. He was responsible. He was funny and social. The kind of person who walked into a room and made it feel a little more alive. His parents, Brian and Annette, described their relationship with him as genuinely close. Not just parent and child, but people who liked each other, who talked, who trusted each other. He had one younger sister. The family was tight. Brandon graduated from Marshall High School in 2007. He was not the kind of kid who drifted after graduation. He had a plan. He had enrolled at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 30 miles northeast of Marshall, in their wind turbine technology program. This was 2007 and 2008, right at the beginning of the renewable energy boom in the Midwest. Wind turbines were beginning to appear across the flat Minnesota landscape like giant mechanical flowers. Brandon saw the future coming and wanted to be part of it. He was practical. He was forward-thinking. He was excited about what came next. In the fall of 2008, he was planning to transfer to Iowa Western College, a 250-mile move that would have been his first time living truly on his own. He was looking forward to it. He was, by every measurable standard, a young man on an upward trajectory. He was also, by every account, a careful person. His friends described him as responsible. His father later told investigators that even though Brandon had been at parties that night and had consumed some alcohol, he did not seem impaired during any of their phone conversations. He was coherent. He was logical. He was making plans and following through on them. This is important to understand before we get to what happened, because the question that has haunted this case for 17 years is simple and devastating. How does a careful, sober-thinking, responsible young man, in phone contact with his parents, simply cease to exist on a flat stretch of rural road in the middle of the night? There is no good answer. But let's walk through what we know happened, minute by minute, because the details matter enormously. May 13th, 2008 was the last day of spring semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. If you've ever been in college, you know what that means. It means celebration. It means relief. It means the particular joy of putting your textbooks away and knowing that, for a little while, you're free. Brandon and his friends planned accordingly. That evening, Brandon attended a party at a friend's house in Lynd, Minnesota, a tiny community about 10 miles southwest of Marshall. The gathering was described by everyone who attended it as low-key. Some drinks, some friends, nothing wild. Brandon had a few drinks but was, by all witness accounts, not visibly intoxicated when he left. He didn't go home yet. He drove to a second party in Canby, the same town where his college campus was located, about 30 miles from Marshall. This was a smaller gathering. He stayed briefly, had another drink, one shot, witnesses said, and sometime between midnight and 12:30 in the morning, he said his goodbyes and got back in his car to drive home to Marshall. Here is the first decision that changed everything. Marshall was accessible from Canby by a direct, well-lit route, Highway 68. Straight shot, simple drive. A route Brandon had taken many times before. Brandon did not take Highway 68. Instead, he turned onto the rural back roads, the gravel county routes that cut through the fields. Why? No one knows for certain. Maybe he was more disoriented than his friends realized. Maybe he thought it was a shortcut. Maybe he just wasn't thinking clearly about directions. Whatever the reason, Brandon Swanson drove northeast into the darkness on a gravel road instead of south on a highway. And he drove for a while, long enough that he was no longer anywhere near where he thought he was. At approximately 1:15 in the morning, he drove into a ditch. The car wasn't damaged. He wasn't hurt. The vehicle was simply stuck, what he would later describe to his father as high-centered, meaning the undercarriage was resting on the edge of the road while the wheels spun uselessly. He tried to rock it out. It didn't work. So he called his parents. Brian Swanson picked up. Brandon told him what happened. Stuck on a rural road somewhere near Lynd, needed a pickup. Brian and Annette got in their car immediately. Brian stayed on the phone with Brandon while Annette drove. And here is where this story begins its descent into something genuinely inexplicable. Brandon told his father he was near Lynd. His parents drove to Lynd. They could not find him. For most of the next hour, Brian Swanson drove the dark roads around Lynd while his son narrated what he could see, which wasn't much. Fields, a fence line, some lights in the distance that he thought might be a town. He started walking toward those lights. Brandon told his father he could see lights ahead and was going to walk toward them, figuring his parents could pick him up wherever the lights were. Brian drove toward where his son said the lights were. He could not find him. This pattern, Brandon describing his location, Brian driving to it, neither being able to locate the other, continued for the entire duration of the call. 47 minutes of a father and his son trying to find each other in the dark, failing at every turn. What neither of them knew, what would only become clear after Brandon was gone and investigators traced his cell phone records, was that Brandon was not near Lynd at all. He was near Taunton. Taunton, Minnesota is a tiny community about 7 miles north of Lynd. And critically, a Taunton grain elevator has a red warning light on top, visible for miles across the flat landscape at night. Brandon had seen that red light. He thought he was looking at the lights of Lynd. He was actually looking at a grain elevator light in a completely different town, 7 miles away from where he told his father he was. Brian Swanson was driving around Lynd looking for a son who was 7 miles north of him the entire time. Think about that. Think about what that means. Two people on the phone with each other, genuinely trying to find each other, separated by 7 miles, because a single red light on a grain elevator, visible on a flat landscape on a dark night, convinced a disoriented young man that he was looking at a town. That's the geography of this case. That's the first layer of the tragedy. The second layer is what happened next. Brian Swanson was still on the phone with his son, still driving, still trying to find him. Brandon was still walking, toward lights he thought were a town, but that were actually a grain elevator, 7 miles from where his parents were searching. He mentioned passing fences. He mentioned hearing water nearby. He described walking along a field road in the dark. And then, without any warning, without any gradual lead-up, without any sound of struggle or fall, Brandon Swanson said 2 words to his father. "Oh shit." And the call ended. Not a gradual degradation. Not a, "Dad, I'm," before it cuts out. Just those 2 words, sharp and sudden. And then silence. Brian Swanson called back immediately. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Brandon never picked up. Brian kept calling. Annette kept calling. They drove every road they could think of. Nothing. No answer. No Brandon standing on a roadside waving them down. No return call. By morning, they had no choice. They reported their son missing. And here, the story takes another dark turn. Because the initial police response to Brandon's disappearance would eventually change Minnesota law. When Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing in the early morning hours of May 14, 2008, they ran into a wall that too many families of missing adults know all too well. Brandon was 19 years old. He was legally an adult. He had been at parties. He had consumed alcohol. And so the initial assumption from law enforcement was that he had probably just gone somewhere of his own accord. Maybe he met someone. Maybe he was sleeping it off somewhere. He was a 19-year-old on the last day of school. Adults have the right to go missing. No immediate large-scale search was launched. Hours passed. Critical hours in a missing persons case. The hours when a scent is still fresh, when a trail is still warm, when a person who might be injured or in danger might still be saved, passed while the Swansons were told to wait. By the time a serious search effort began, Nearly half a day had elapsed since Brandon's last known communication. It is impossible to know whether an immediate response would have changed the outcome. But it is a question that has tortured the Swanson family for 17 years. And it is a question that eventually drove them to do something remarkable with their grief. But we'll come to that. The search, when it finally began in earnest, was enormous by any measure. Law enforcement from multiple agencies, including the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, coordinated search efforts. Volunteers from across the region came out. Eventually, over 500 people would participate in searches, covering more than 120 square miles of southwestern Minnesota. Bloodhounds were brought in from Cottington County, South Dakota. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the fields. Boats searched the waterways. All-terrain vehicles combed the field roads. Brandon's car was found the day after he went missing. It was located 25 miles away from where he had told his parents he was, confirming what cell phone records would show, that Brandon had been near Taunton, not Lynd. The car was undamaged, sitting just off a field approach road, exactly as Brandon had described. His keys were in it. His personal belongings were still inside. But Brandon himself was nowhere. The bloodhounds picked up a scent trail from the car. They followed it for 3 miles, across gravel roads, along fence lines, through fields, before it led them to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River. And there, the trail became more complicated. One of the dogs followed the scent to the river's edge, which initially suggested to investigators that Brandon had gone into the water. The Yellow Medicine River runs through this stretch of Minnesota. And in May 2008, it was running high and fast from spring snowmelt. In some areas, it was knee-deep. In others, 15 feet. It moved with force. Boats were immediately deployed. The river was searched. Gates were installed downstream to catch any remains. Nothing was found. Not a single item of Brandon's clothing. Not his phone. Not a trace. But here is one of the most puzzling details of the entire case, and it is a detail that has made investigators and analysts genuinely uncertain about the river theory. Brandon's phone continued to ring after he disappeared. For 2 days after the call with his father ended, until approximately May 16, 2008, incoming calls to Brandon's cell phone resulted in multiple rings before going to voicemail. Not one ring and voicemail, the way a phone responds when it's off or submerged in water. Multiple rings. The phone was on. The phone was functioning. How do you reconcile a phone that still rings with a theory that its owner drowned in a river? You can't. Not easily. And there's more. One of the bloodhounds, after leading its handler to the river's edge, did not stop there. That dog crossed the river, picked up the scent on the other side, and followed it along the far bank to another gravel road, continuing north toward the Yellow Medicine County line before the scent finally disappeared. Brandon's own mother, Annette, seized on this detail. "There really is nothing to indicate that he's in the river," she told CNN. The dog crossed. The scent continued. Whatever happened to her son, she believed, it did not end in that water. And later, search dogs in a different area, northwest of a small community called Porch, indicated human remains in an area that had not been thoroughly searched. That area was searched. Nothing was found. Sheriff Jack Vizecki, who took the search personally, walking 2 miles of the Yellow Medicine River himself every single day for 30 consecutive days after Brandon vanished, told reporters he could not rule out foul play. "There was nothing to indicate Brandon is in the river," he said, echoing Annette Swanson's words. The search continued through the summer of 2008. It resumed that fall, after the harvested fields opened up again. It picked up each spring for 3 years as snow melted and the fields lay bare before planting season. 500 volunteers, 120 square miles, 3 years of organized searches, and nothing. Not one tangible trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been found. There is one detail in this case that has received less attention than the phone call, the river, or the scent trail. And I think it may be the most important detail of all. Landowners. In the weeks and months after Brandon disappeared, search teams working the area encountered a specific and frustrating obstacle. Some landowners in the 140 square mile search area refused to allow access to their property. In a missing persons case, in a search for a 19-year-old kid, refused. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension both confirmed this publicly. It became, as one later report described it, a controversial point in the investigation. Ultimately, no charges or further evidence emerged from those specific properties. But consider what that means. The search zone covered 140 square miles of private agricultural land. Some of that land was never searched at all. Not because investigators didn't want to search it, because they were not allowed. Whatever Brandon walked into on the night of May 14, 2008, whether it was an accident, whether it was foul play, whether it was something no one has yet imagined, may be sitting in an unsearched field right now, on land that investigators were turned away from. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. Before we get to the theories, I want to talk about something that gets overlooked in almost every account of this case: the geography. Because understanding the landscape Brandon was moving through that night is essential to understanding why 17 years of searching have produced nothing. Southwestern Minnesota is not like most of the places Americans think about when they imagine the Midwest. It is not rolling hills. It is not forests. It is flat. Almost perfectly, dramatically flat. In a way that feels almost surreal to anyone who didn't grow up there. Drive through it in daylight, and you can see for miles in every direction, across fields of soybeans and corn that run to the horizon like a green ocean. At night, that same landscape transforms into something else entirely. The absence of elevation means there are almost no landmarks. The absence of streetlights, there are none on the county roads, means the darkness is absolute except for whatever your headlights illuminate. And the gravel roads, which crisscross the farmland in a grid, all look exactly the same in the dark. This is the world Brandon was navigating on foot, after midnight, in the cold. He had grown up nearby. He knew this region in a general sense, but knowing a region and being able to navigate a specific stretch of gravel road in complete darkness, while disoriented about your starting position by 7 miles, are very different things. There is also the matter of the natural features. The Yellow Medicine River runs through this area, but it is not a dramatic waterway. It does not announce itself. It does not have obvious banks that a person in daylight would notice from a distance. In many stretches, it runs through low ground that looks, in the dark, like just another flat area until you are suddenly in it. The drainage ditches and irrigation channels that supplement it are similarly deceptive. They are dug into the field edges, barely visible from the road, easily stumbled into by someone who doesn't know exactly where they are. A person walking in the dark in this landscape, navigating by the faint red light of a grain elevator they have mistaken for a town, moving across fields and along fence lines, could cover significant ground without ever being sure where they were going. And if that person stepped wrong, into a ditch, off a bank, into a drainage channel, they could find themselves in serious trouble faster than they would in almost any other terrain. This is the landscape that swallowed Brandon Swanson, and it is the landscape that has refused to give him back.
做嘅美卡首都封告纵火的事情，另外在得在绝地四战族之后故事的有趣。呢處絕地聖戰同處了句後。
Let's talk about the phone call itself, because it is refused to give him back. Let's talk about the phone call itself, because it is refused to give him back and surprised. This is the landscape that swallowed Jolong is wearied being. Let's talk about the phone call that is refused to give him back. Let's talk about the phone call that is refused to give him back and surprised. This is the landscape that swallowed Brandon Swanson, and it is the landscape that has refused to give him back and surprised. Let's talk about the phone call that has refused to give him back and surprised. Let's talk about the phone call that has refused to give him back and surprised. Let's talk about the phone call that has refused to give him back and surprised. Let is the phone call itself, because it deserves more examination than it usually gets. 47 minutes is a long time to be on the phone. Long enough for a person to say a great deal. Long enough for a father to get a real picture of what his son was experiencing. Brian Swanson later told investigators that Brandon, throughout the call, seemed coherent. Not panicked, not confused in a way that suggested serious intoxication. He was describing his surroundings. He was problem-solving, walking toward lights, trying to give his father landmarks. He was working the problem the way a reasonable, functional person works a problem. He mentioned fences. He mentioned hearing water. He mentioned the lights he was walking toward. At no point during those 47 minutes did he express fear. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't whispering. He was just walking, in the dark, talking to his dad, trying to get home. And then, oh shit. 2 words. The end. Those 2 words have been analyzed endlessly by investigators, amateur sleuths, and true crime researchers for 17 years. What did they mean? What triggered them? The most obvious interpretation is that Brandon was surprised by something. The exclamation is instinctive. It's the sound a person makes when something unexpected happens suddenly. A stumble, a fall, something appearing out of the darkness. But what? The terrain in that area includes the Yellow Medicine River and its tributaries, drainage ditches, irrigation channels, and field approaches, any of which, in the dark, could catch someone by surprise. The temperature that night was approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia in a person who fell into water, but not so cold that exposure alone would be immediately dangerous for someone on dry ground. The sudden ending of the call, combined with the phone continuing to ring afterward, has led some investigators and analysts to conclude that whatever caused Brandon's final exclamation, it was sudden enough that he could not or did not place his phone down intentionally. He didn't hang up. He didn't set the phone aside. The call simply ended. Did he drop the phone? Did he fall? Did someone, or something, end the call for him? 17 years later, the answer remains unknown. Let's go through the theories, because there are several, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The first and most widely accepted theory is accidental drowning in the Yellow Medicine River. The river was high and fast on the night Brandon disappeared. The Bloodhound Trail led to its banks. The terrain in the area would have made it easy, in the dark, to stumble off a bank and into moving water, particularly water that was running 15 feet deep in places. The case for this theory, it explains the sudden, oh shit, a stumble and fall into cold, fast water. It explains why no body was found on land. A body submerged in a fast-moving river in May 2008 could theoretically have been carried far downstream and never recovered, or become trapped under debris. The case against it. The phone continued to ring for 2 days after the call ended. A phone submerged in a river in 2008 would not have continued to ring. And the bloodhound that tracked his scent to the river continued across it, following the scent on the other side. If Brandon drowned, the scent would not have continued to the far bank. Sheriff Fizecki himself walked that stretch of river every day for a month and found nothing. River searches with boats and divers found nothing. If Brandon drowned in the Yellow Medicine River, his body has been held there against all physical probability for 17 years without surfacing. The second theory is hypothermia and exposure. This theory holds that Brandon did not drown, but became disoriented, wandered far from the road, and succumbed to the cold at 40 degrees. He could be lying in a field or inside an abandoned outbuilding in an area that has never been searched. The case for it. The temperature was cold enough to be dangerous for a wet or lightly dressed person over several hours. The terrain is vast. Some areas were never searched due to landowner refusals. If Brandon walked far enough from the road before collapsing, his remains might simply be in a location that hasn't been looked at. The case against it. 40 degrees is cold, but not immediately lethal for a dressed person who is moving. Brandon's jacket, jeans, and sneakers, while not winter gear, were not inadequate for an hour or two of walking. If he collapsed from hypothermia, some trace of him, clothing, belongings, skeletal remains, would likely have surfaced during the 3-year cycle of extensive searches. And again, the phone kept ringing. The third theory is foul play. Someone was in that area at that moment who meant Brandon harm. A predator. A robbery gone wrong. Someone who saw his flashers when he first drove into the ditch and decided to track him. The case for it. The "oh shit" suggests sudden surprise, something that appeared without warning. A person who emerged from the dark, a car that pulled up suddenly, a voice from a direction Brandon wasn't expecting. The complete absence of any physical remains, even after 17 years and 120 square miles of searching, is consistent with a body being concealed deliberately. And those landowners who refused search access, well, that detail has never been fully explained. The case against it. There is, officially, no evidence of foul play. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at the scene of the car or along the trail to suggest violence. And in rural, sparse southwestern Minnesota, a predator targeting a random person on a back road at 2 a.m. would have been extraordinary. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Investigators never closed the foul play possibility. And the search dogs that indicated human remains near Mud Creek, north of Porter, an indication that led to a search that found nothing, have never been fully explained either. The fourth theory is that Brandon staged his own disappearance and is alive somewhere, living under a different name. This is the theory that his family has most consistently and passionately rejected, and the evidence strongly supports them. Brandon was on the phone with his father, actively trying to be found, for 47 minutes. He was planning a college transfer in 4 months. He had big plans and genuine excitement about the future. He had a close, loving family he had no reason to flee. There was no financial motive, no criminal entanglement, no secret life uncovered in the investigation. For him to have staged a disappearance that is held for 17 years in a digital age with facial recognition and national databases would require a level of premeditation and sophistication that is almost impossible to attribute to the 19-year-old who called his parents from a ditch. Investigators analyzed this possibility using what is called an equivocal missing person analysis, a psychological profile of the case, and concluded that voluntary disappearance was extremely unlikely. The Swanson family has never doubted this. The fifth possibility, the one that almost nobody talks about because it sounds implausible, but has never been definitively ruled out, is that Brandon is somewhere in that 140 square mile search zone that was never searched. In an area a landowner closed to investigators. In a natural feature the ground searches missed. In some fold of this flat landscape that has held its secret for 17 years. Somewhere. Still there, waiting to be found. Here is what I believe is the most important and most underreported consequence of Brandon Swanson's disappearance. When Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing in the early hours of May 14, 2008, police did not immediately launch a search. Brandon was 19. He was an adult. There was an assumption that he had simply gone somewhere voluntarily, that he had a right to disappear. By the time a serious search began, hours had passed. The Swansons believed, and professional analysts later supported the view, that this delay may have been critically significant. The scent that bloodhounds eventually followed was 3 days old by the time it was tracked. Witnesses who might have seen something were not interviewed immediately. Whatever happened to Brandon in those first hours unfolded without any law enforcement response. Brian and Annette Swanson decided to do something with that knowledge. They met with Marty Seifert, then the minority leader of the Minnesota House of Representatives. They told him their son's story. They explained what had happened, how the assumption that an adult has a right to be missing had paralyzed the initial response to their son's disappearance. Seifert listened. In May 2009, exactly 1 year after Brandon vanished, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's Law into the statutes of the state of Minnesota.
Brandon's Law requires law enforcement to immediately begin a preliminary investigation when an adult goes missing under potentially dangerous circumstances, regardless of age, regardless of any assumption that the person may have chosen to disappear. It eliminates the waiting period. It mandates action. "We knew it wouldn't bring Brandon back," Annette Swanson said. "But it could save someone else." Think about that. In the middle of their grief, with no answers, no remains, no resolution, Brian and Annette Swanson used the worst experience of their lives to protect strangers, to make sure that no other family would sit by the phone for hours, waiting for a search to begin while the trail went cold. Brandon's Law has been in effect for 15 years. In that time, it has changed how missing adult cases are handled across Minnesota, how many people it has helped find, how many families it has given back their loved ones will never be fully counted. But the number is not zero. Brandon Swanson never came home, but his name is written into the laws of his state, and it is doing work in the world. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. I want to take a moment to talk about what sustained grief actually looks like in a case like this. Because we talk about disappearances in terms of investigations and theories and timelines, and those things matter. But behind every file number and every search grid is a family that has been living inside a wound that will not close. Brian and Annette Swanson have given interviews over the years. They have spoken at public events. They have worked with legislators and law enforcement and victim advocacy organizations. They have done all of this while simultaneously never knowing, not for one day, not for one morning when they wake up, whether their son is alive or dead, whether he suffered, whether he is lying undiscovered in a field, 30 miles from the house where he grew up.
That particular kind of grief, the grief of not knowing, is something that mental health professionals sometimes call ambiguous loss. It is considered one of the most psychologically devastating experiences a human being can endure, precisely because it refuses to resolve. You cannot fully mourn someone who might be alive. You cannot fully move on because moving on would feel like giving up. You cannot have a funeral or a grave to visit or a fixed point of closure. You are held permanently in the space between hoping and mourning, and you stay there for years. Annette Swanson has spoken publicly about keeping the porch light on.
It began as a symbol of hope, a signal to Brandon that home was still here, that the door was still open, that they had not stopped looking. Over 17 years, it has become something else, too. A testimony. A refusal to pretend the question has been answered. A quiet, every-night declaration that Brandon Swanson existed, that he mattered, and that he is still missing. The last known photograph of Brandon was taken sometime in the weeks before his disappearance. He is 19 in it. He will always be 19 in it. Time-progressed photos have been released showing what he might look like today, what a 36-year-old Brandon Swanson might look like, if he is alive somewhere. His blue eyes, his naturally curly brown hair, his black, wire-framed glasses. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension still has his case open. His dental records and DNA are on file for comparison. His description is still in the national databases. Someone, somewhere, might recognize a face. There is one more thing I want to say about this case that I have not seen written anywhere else, and it is this. Brandon Swanson's disappearance is, in a specific and important way, a story about the limits of what technology can do. In 2008, we had cell phones. We had GPS technology. We had the ability to track a signal in real time, in theory. And yet a father and his son, on the phone together for 47 minutes, could not find each other on a dark road in rural Minnesota, because the assumptions Brandon made about his location were wrong, and neither of them had the tools to correct that in real time. If this happened today, in 2026, it would be different. Share location on an iPhone takes 3 taps. Google Maps shows your position to within a few meters. Brian Swanson could have looked at his phone and seen exactly where his son was standing, regardless of what Brandon thought about his location. The 7-mile discrepancy between Lynd and Taunton would have been corrected within the first minute of the call. Brandon would have been found. That gap between what technology was capable of in 2008 and what it is capable of today is the width of this entire tragedy. A few years earlier, and it would have been the same story. A few years later, and it would have been a brief, forgettable incident. Kid got stuck in a ditch. Parents picked him up. Everyone went home. Instead, it happened in the exact window when the technology existed to maintain contact, but not to verify location. When a red light on a grain elevator could convince a disoriented young man that he was 7 miles from where he actually stood. That is an almost unbearably specific kind of bad luck.
And it is one of the reasons this case stays with people long after they first hear it. Not because it is fantastical, not because it involves inexplicable events or supernatural theories, but because it is so achingly, precisely ordinary in its mechanism. A kid at the wrong place, a mistaken landmark, a darkness that swallowed the difference between where he thought he was and where he actually stood. And 2 words, and then silence. As of 2026, 17 years after Brandon Swanson said, "Oh shit," and the line went dead, here is what we know. His car was found 25 miles from where he told his parents he was. No damage, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. His cell phone rang for 2 days after the call ended. It has never been found. Bloodhounds tracked his scent 3 miles from the car to the Yellow Medicine River, and then, according to one dog, across the river and up the far bank to another road. Search dogs later indicated human remains near Mud Creek. That area was searched. Nothing was found. More than 500 volunteers spent more than 120 days covering more than 120 square miles of southwestern Minnesota. Some areas were never searched because landowners refused access. No body, no clothing, no personal effects, no trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been recovered. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension continues to accept tips. The phone number is 877-996-6222. The case remains officially open. And every single night, for 17 years and counting, Brian and Annette Swanson leave their porch light on. Every single night. Because they are still waiting. Because he is still their son. Because the light that should have been guiding him home that night in May 2008 is still burning on the front porch of a house in Marshall, Minnesota, visible from the road. Come home, Brandon. We left the light on. There is a question I want to leave you with, because I think it is the question this case deserves and rarely gets asked directly. We know Brandon's last words. We know the call lasted 47 minutes. We know the phone rang for 2 days. We know the dogs crossed the river. We know landowners refused access. We know that no trace has been found in 17 years of searching. What we don't know, what no one knows, is which of these facts is the key. Is the ringing phone the key? Does it mean Brandon survived the "oh shit" moment by hours? Survived long enough to walk somewhere, to find shelter, to collapse somewhere that has never been searched? Are the landowners the key? Is there something on one of those refused properties that investigators were never allowed to find? Is the dog that crossed the river the key? Is Brandon somewhere north of the Yellow Medicine, in an area that received less attention because the main theory pointed to the water? Or is there a sixth theory, one that hasn't been articulated yet, one that would require information we don't have, that would make all of these pieces fall into place? 17 years, no answers. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old. He had a wind turbine certificate and plans for college, and a family that loved him and a future he was genuinely excited about. He called his dad from a ditch because that's what kids do when they need help. He walked towards some lights in the dark because that's what a rational, calm, problem-solving person does. He said, "Oh shit," because something happened. And then he was gone. If you know anything, if you've heard anything in the past 17 years, in a bar or at a kitchen table or in a field somewhere in southwestern Minnesota, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is still listening. Brandon's parents are still listening too. The porch light is still on. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Every week, we go deep on the cases that refuse to be forgotten.